Today I'd like to begin to discuss some of the dynamics that go on within ecosystems. And one of these is the process of succession. And when we talk about ecosystems, ecosystems are defined as being self-sustaining, but ecosystems can transition from one type of ecosystem into another over time. So that's what succession involves, the change of one ecosystem into another over time. And so there are two types of succession that we are generally recognize. Primary succession, which begins on bare rock, or at least a place where there's been no previous vegetation, and secondary succession, which begins on previously existing soil or a place where there has previously been vegetation. And so when we look at succession, we tend to see a transition through different types of species. First, so-called pioneer species. Pioneer species are the first to show up in a certain type of succession. And generally speaking, they are short-lived and reproduce pretty quickly. They'll contribute to soil production. Over time, they're replaced by what are known as equilibrium species. And the equilibrium species tend to be longer-lived. Instead of being annuals, for example, they'll be perennials, live for more than 1 year at a time. And they also then help contribute to soil production and construction and so on. And eventually, a particular species will begin to dominate and will eventually be what we call the climax species. So the climax species then will be the so-called dominant species in that particular ecosystem, and ecosystems typically take their name from the dominant or climax vegetation in this successive series. And succession literally can take centuries or even millennia to occur. So as we've discussed before then, the physical environment influences the producers in an ecosystem, which in turn influences the consumers, and we can have some feedback in these systems as well. So we will begin to discuss some of this feedback in this particular process of succession. So first of all, primary succession, as I mentioned, begins either on bare rock or in places where there's not previously been vegetation. And so here, especially if it's bare rock, the lichens will be the first organisms to appear. And we've talked about lichens before. The lichens can grow on rock, and the fungal component of lichens will help break down the rock, contribute to soil production. And then as soil begins to accumulate, then grasses and other annuals, and by annuals I mean basically plants that live for a year at a time. So they will grow, they will flower out, seed out, and then die off, and then repeat the cycle. But the annuals then, as they decompose, contribute to soil production. So in primary succession, both lichens and grasses or other annuals then would be what we consider pioneer species. And again, in some of the northern areas, the Rocky Mountain areas, fireweed would be an example of this, but there are many others. And then shrubs will begin to replace over time these grasses and annuals, and again help contribute to soil, as will eventually the shrubs be replaced by possibly a mixed forest in which you will have quite a bit of diversity. And again, these would be considered equilibrium species in primary succession. And then finally, a particular type of plant vegetation will dominate. And again, if we're looking at a succession that ends in a forest ecosystem, then that would eventually form a mature forest or a climax forest, and that particular species would be the climax species. So one of the things I want you to understand, however, is that not all succession necessarily leads to a forest ecosystem. That partly depends on, again, the climate, the geology, the topography, and so on. Latitude also could play a role in this. So not all succession lends itself to ending in a forest, but again, that's one of the examples that we're looking at here. So again, at some point, a dominant vegetation emerges and takes over basically that ecosystem. Now, secondary succession is sometimes described as reversion to a previous state of succession. And in secondary succession, the key is that there's existing soil. So in this situation, then, typically grasses and again, a primary cause of secondary succession is fire. So basically, if you burn off the climax forest, in this case, you're left with soil. And so now then, succession just picks up from that point in secondary succession. So here, grasses or annuals would be the first things to appear. And again, they would be the pioneer species. Lichens, not so much, because you don't really see lichens growing on soil. And then, again, shrubs and mixed forest would eventually replace the grasses. And they would constitute the equilibrium species. And again, if we're looking at a forest ecosystem, eventually a certain type of tree will basically outgrow the others, shade out the rest of the plants, and become the climax species. So again, there are many, many different types of secondary succession. And so I'd like you to take a look at a video segment that we did past summer up in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I'm standing in this slough in Yellowstone National Park to show you an example of secondary succession in action. I'm standing in an area that is a drainage of snowmelt that occurs in late spring and early summer. And you can see this drainage is bordered then by coniferous forest dominated by lodgepole pine. And the reason the lodgepole pines can't move into this area is that it's just too wet. The water will drown the roots. And so this is, again, a slough. It's a seasonal wetland. It will be very, very wet as it is right now as I stand in it. And then this will dry out in the late summer and develop into a meadow ecosystem. Now, as the water flows through this area, of course you can see that there are grasses, sedges, other plants growing here. They slow down the rate of water flow. That takes sediments out of the water and leads to soil accumulation. And so as the soil builds up, it raises this area, dries it out, and then allows the conifers to get a foothold and intrude into the area. So what's going to happen here over time is that we're going to go from a wetland to a seasonal wetland, which transitions into meadows, and then eventually the conifers will begin to intrude into this area as well. So this is just one of thousands of examples of secondary succession. So the key then is that, succession it can take many different forms, and we're just looking at some examples of that. But again, there are many, many different types of succession. Now, and again, so we have talked about a couple of examples here, but the other thing I do want to mention too is that it's not just biomes that are potentially affected here. It could also affect marine ecosystems. So for example, you could have some benthic ecosystem like we're looking at here, and then if that's dredged, that will completely wipe out the ecosystem. And so again, there would be a type of succession that would also occur in the marine ecosystems. Now, when we look at causes of succession, or at least of secondary succession, there are a couple of terms that we use here. One would be allogenic causes, and allogenic causes are external causes. So things like fire, development, human development would be another example here. And so in other words, causes that are outside of the control of the ecosystem per se. And then other changes are so-called autogenic changes, and these are the ones that I've talked about already. So grasses, annuals, living, dying, contributing to soil production will trigger a change over time because soil production then leads to the ability of shrubs, trees, and so on to begin to grow. So again, these are so-called self-induced changes in succession. Now, also again, because there are so many types of succession, again, we've only talked about a couple of types here. There are some general trends that we see in succession. And so generally early in succession, what we see is in terms of the nutrients, that early in succession nutrients are found in the soil, whereas late in succession, you will find those nutrients tied up in the biomass. By that I mean basically the plants in the food chain. The biomass, early in succession, there's very little biomass. Again, if you look at the pioneer species, grasses, lichens, things like that, they don't have a whole lot of mass to them. Yet late in succession, where you have trees and forests and things like that, there's a tremendous amount of biomass. Diversity tends to be low early in succession, and it tends to be relatively high late in succession. However, I can think of some ecosystems, like the lodgepole pine ecosystem, really that has relatively low diversity. So I wouldn't say that that always is the case, but it's generally higher than what you start with early in succession. And then last but not least, the types of species you find. Early in succession, they're so-called R-selected species, which generally speaking means reproductive selected. So they are short-lived and fast reproducers. Whereas late in succession, you're looking at plants that are K-selected, which stands for kind of equilibrium, the K stand in equilibrium. And these would be plants that are long-lived and reproduce a little more slowly. Now, another type of a dynamic that we see in ecosystems are feedback loops. And so what the feedback loops involve is some kind of a stimulus that leads to a response that in some way feeds back on the stimulus, either to increase the stimulus or to decrease the stimulus. So they're so-called positive and negative feedback loops. And so first I want to consider positive feedback loops. And again, in a positive feedback loop, then we would have some kind of a stimulus that would lead to a response, and that would feed back on the stimulus, increasing the stimulus. So one of the things that I hope is obvious here is that this is really typically rare in nature, because if you have a positive feedback loop, that takes you away from the status quo, that takes you away from equilibrium. And so the thing about feedback loops is that the response increases the stimulus, increases the response, and that this induces a cycle that it really kind of spirals out of control. And so in terms of physiology and ecosystems, you don't see feedback loops very often, but one of the places you do see them is in population cycles. So again, what I'd like you to do is take a look at another video segment that we taped up in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem looking at the bison population as part of a positive feedback loop. As you can see by this bison herd over my right shoulder here in Hayden Valley in Yellowstone National Park, this is one of the places that bison like to aggregate. And historically, there have been two major controls on bison populations. One of those is wolf predation, and the other would be severe winters. Now in the 20th century, both of those controls essentially have been lifted from the bison population. Wolves were eliminated from the park early in the century, and late in the century the earth began to warm, and mortality from winter kill is much less than it used to be. Also, winter management of the park is different than it was 20 years ago. There's a lot more snowmobiling and so on, and so there's compacted snow that the bison can travel over. They're able to move from one part of the park to the other fairly easily in winter, whereas in the past they were not able to do that. So they can find better forage in the winter than they could previously. So one of the questions that comes up occasionally is that people will ask me, well, why worry about bison populations? Why is there a need to manage bison populations? And the answer to that really is off to my left. You can see a lodgepole pine here that is severely damaged, and that is bison damage. So bison tend to rub off their winter wool on trees. They also rub their horns on the trees to sharpen the horns. And they'll also, even the males will sometimes be acting out aggressive displays on the trees as well. And as you can see, that severely damages the bark to the point where sugars cannot be transported to the roots. That eventually kills the tree. When the tree dies, that tends to lead to more grasses. More grasses means more bison means more tree damage. So effectively what the bison do here in the park is that they deforest the ecosystem. As a result, then, there needs to be some kind of a cap on the herd, and since there are no longer natural caps on the herd, this was one of the justifications to reintroduce the wolves. And as expected, when wolves were first brought into the park, they've predated heavily on the elk population because there were so many elk, and elk are relatively easy to kill compared to a bison. But as the elk population has contracted and decreased, more and more wolves are turning to bison as another food supply. So that is part of the plan, and so far that's working pretty well. Now, we can't really do anything about climate, however, and the wolves alone are not going to be able to control this population. So as a result, then, there is a management plan to try to deal with the ever-growing bison population. So in looking at that feedback loop then with the bison, then basically what's happening is that the increased bison population basically deforests, leads to more grassland means more food means more bison means more deforestation, which means more grassland, which means more bison, which means more deforestation. So that's the loop that's problematic there. And again, with positive feedback loops, it takes something from the outside to break that loop. And so again, in this case, it's going to be the reintroduction of the wolves, we hope, as opposed to some unnatural type of control. Now, negative feedback is just the opposite of that. So again, we'll have some kind of a stimulus that leads to a response that feeds back negatively on the stimulus, basically meaning it turns off the stimulus. And so this is much more common in nature, a much more common event, because it helps maintain stability. So physiologically, for example, you and I want to maintain the same temperature, we want to maintain the same pH in our blood. So we are constantly using negative feedback mechanisms in our body to keep our internal environment constant and the same. And the same kind of thing tends to happen in nature. And so an example from nature, for example, would involve beaver and beaver behavior. As you may be aware, beavers like to build dams across across streams. And so then they can build some amazing structures. And we see these often up in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And you may not have ever thought about it, but why do they build that dam? Well, it's of course to get the water to build up behind the dam and create a pond. Well, why do they want a pond? A lot of people think it's so that they can eat fish, but beavers are herbivores. They don't eat fish. So the reason they're building that pond is so that they can build a hutch, build their home out in the middle of that pond, and then their hutch will have an underwater entrance. So really what they're doing by building that dam is that they're building and creating basically a moat for their home, which will be out in the middle of the pond. So what will happen then is if there's a breach in their dam, if their dam starts leaking and the water level starts to go down, that triggers a change in their behavior. They will get very active. They'll start cutting down shrubs and trees and so on. They'll plug up the dam. That stops the leak. So again, here the stimulus would be a leak in the dam. The response is a change in the behavior of the beaver. It repairs the leak, and that stops the leak. So that maintains the status quo. So negative feedback is much more common in ecosystems. Now, another dynamic that we have to account for, and again, as I'm talking about these, I'm also kind of approaching this in terms of an eye towards management, because again, there's a lot of human impact on nature, and so we have to be able to manage ecosystems, so we need to understand these dynamics that are ongoing within ecosystems. So another kind of dynamic that we have to consider is synergism. And synergism is where combined effects are greater or lesser than what we anticipate. And typically this involves chemicals. And there are two types of synergism. There's positive synergism and negative synergism. And in the case of positive synergism, the combined effect is greater than what we expect it to be. So it's kind of a 2 + 2 = 5 effect, if you will. So again, typically this involves chemicals. So again, you might be drinking alcohol as a sedative, and it might relax you. You might be taking some kind of prescription drug as a sedative to calm you. And if you combine that prescription drug with the alcohol, it might be enough to sedate you to the point where you stop breathing and it kills you. So that would be an example of positive synergism, not because it's a good thing, but because the combined effect is greater than what was anticipated. And so, for example, when you go to the doctor, or if you go to the doctor and they give you medications, or the pharmacist, a lot of times they want to know, what else are you taking? What other drugs are you taking, so that they can avoid these synergistic effects? But we also see these in ecosystems. And again, sometimes what will happen is that animals start dying, and we need to figure out, why are they dying? Is it some natural effect? Is it some chemical in the environment? Is it some combination of chemicals that are reacting in a way we never anticipated? And then negative synergism is where the combined effect is less than what you expect. So a 2 + 2 = 1 kind of situation. And an example here would be acids and bases. And we've talked about acids and bases. You have a very reactive compound in an acid, a very reactive compound in a base. Yet if you put them together, they neutralize one another, and you actually have basically salt water, which is certainly not a hazardous compound. Now, another dynamic that we see in ecosystems, and again can be problematic in terms of management, is biological magnification. And this is where, again, we're normally talking toxins, but where toxins magnify in the food chain as we look at concentrations of toxins in different types of organisms. And an example of this involves, again, typically chemicals. DDT was really the first example of this. But PCBs would be one that also is problematic. And so as you look at this diagram, you can see that when you look in the environment here, you're looking at levels that are extremely low, 0.025 parts per million. Yet when you go through the food chain and eventually end up in the herring gull, you're looking at concentrations in our tissues of 124 parts per million of the PCBs. So the question is, well, how can this happen? How does this happen? And biological magnification primarily occurs with what we consider to be fat-soluble substances, as opposed to water-soluble substances. Water-soluble substances dissolve in water, hydrophilic, and those are usually pretty easily eliminated from animal tissue. We basically just excrete them. For example, you and I would just excrete them in our urine. However, fat-soluble compounds get into our fatty tissues, get into cell membranes, get into nerve tissue typically as well, and are not easily excreted from the body. So basically, and this would also be true of heavy metals, things like mercury, lead, and so on. So anyway, when we're exposed to these kind of compounds, rather than flushing them out of our body, they stick in our body. So again, in the case of PCBs, DDT, other pesticides then, they can be in extremely low concentrations in the environment. But again, they're taken in by phytoplankton. And every molecule, let's say of lead or mercury, that phytoplankton takes in, it's going to hold in its tissues throughout its lifetime. So when the zooplankton feeds on those, they're eating the phytoplankton's lifetime aggregation, perhaps, of mercury, if we're talking about mercury, in this case of PCBs. And again, as those zooplankton and phytoplankton are consumed by minnows, they are eating that zooplankton's lifetime accumulation of the PCB in this case, or the phytoplanktons. And then as you move up the food chain, the lake trout's going to eat the minnow and accumulate its lifetime accumulation, as will the herring gull eventually. So with each step up the food chain then, the concentration of the toxin in the tissues increases and increases and increases to the point where it can reach toxic levels and affect behavior. It can affect the reproductive organs and just be outright toxic and start killing the animals. So again, this becomes the problem. Animals start dying. You understand the problem now. It's magnifying in the food chain, and now you have to try to deal with that problem. Can you eliminate PCBs from the environment? Can you eliminate mercury? Can you eliminate lead? Can you eliminate DDT from the environment? That then becomes the problem. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. So again, it's through this food web then that these fat-soluble toxins get exchanged and accumulate. Now, another dynamic is one that we have discussed before, and that basically is in the food chain, the relationship between predators and prey. And we've talked about these population cycles a little bit previously. When you look at predator-prey populations, they typically don't have a nice S curve to them. They normally have this undulating, dramatically increasing, decreasing populations, this cycling. And so one of the things that we biologists try to do is to find unifying principles to understand these kinds of things. And so these predator-prey cycles have been studied a lot. And so, for example, at one time it was thought that predators were driving the cycle. But if you eliminate predators, as we've often done, so for example, in the case of the snowshoe hare and the lynx, if you eliminate the lynx from the ecosystem, you can still have cycling of snowshoe hare populations. And then another time it was thought, well, it must be climate that drives all of this. It just has to do with the food availability for the snowshoe hare, perhaps. And that's true. Sometimes when there's a lot of food available, you do get an increase in the snowshoe hare population, but sometimes there's plenty of food, yet you'll still have the population crashing. So unfortunately, there's no unifying equation here or unifying principle that we can apply to all ecosystems. Basically, now we have to basically go out in the ecosystem, study the food chains, and look at each one individually. But there are three factors that play a role in virtually all of these cycles. One of them is prey food availability. So again, to have an increase in population, you definitely have to have food. But because there's enough food doesn't mean that the population will sustain itself. Another factor is prey density. So as the prey density gets too great, then it can affect the behavior of the prey, and they may stop breeding with one another for a variety of reasons. But what tends to happen is that stress hormones build up in their bloodstream. That then affects their breeding behavior. So even though there's plenty of food, if the prey density is too high, you can still get a crash in their population. And then a third factor would be predator density. So again, if there are an awful lot of predators around, they can impact the prey populations as well. Now, also then, as we look at ecosystems and try and understand ecosystems, we also tend to monitor them over time to look for changes in ecosystems over time. And so again, there are a variety of ways in which we monitor ecosystems, and I'm just going to really just touch on this. It'll be the tip of the iceberg, literally, in some of the things that we do in our approaches in ecology or eco-studies. So one of these is what's known as a quadrat sample. So quadrat sample, it takes its name from the fact, the quadrat basically referring to a quadrangle or a rectangle of some type. And so basically what you do is you'll be in some ecosystem and you basically lay out a quadrat of some type. And it literally may just be a meter square. It could be a quadrat of a larger size depending on what type of ecosystem you're dealing with. And normally you'll use these quadrats to study the producers in an ecosystem. So basically any plants that are touching the edges of your quadrat or within your quadrat, you will count and quantify and then also identify. Now, it doesn't have to be a quadrangle. It could be a different shape. So for example, in forest ecosystems, a lot of times what you'll do is you'll take a tree, measure out a certain distance. Maybe you're going to go out 10 meters, and then you'll just make a circle around the tree. And then any trees touching that perimeter or inside of that perimeter, again, you will identify and quantify. So again, the quadrat doesn't have to be rectangular. It can just basically be some area within which you are identifying species. Now, quadrats typically are combined with what's known as a transect. And so a transect basically means that you're just going to drop a line. You might run a line for 1,000 yards or 10,000 yards in different directions. And then periodically along that transect, you will sample. So you do your quadrats along the transects. And so as you do that, then what you're looking for are transitions from one type of an ecosystem to another, or one type of vegetation to another within your ecosystem. And so then you can begin to build ecosystem maps based on your quadrat samples over your transects. So you may go up slopes, down slopes, parallel to slopes, and so on, trying to profile all the vegetation within your ecosystem. And again, that's done periodically so that you can look for changes in your ecosystem and hopefully mitigate those changes if they start to occur. Also, in terms of animals, there's a variety of different types of capture, tag, recapture techniques in which you basically get an estimate of populations. And there are a lot of ways to estimate populations. This would just be one example. So for example, again, you might capture something like a grizzly bear, put a collar on it, and then release it. And again, I've done some studies involving bats, again, where you capture the bat, tag the bat, and release it. And then hopefully at a later time, you will recapture that animal. And then from that, you can use certain types of equations to estimate population. The problem with these techniques, however, is that there are a couple of problems. One is that you're handling the animals. Anytime you're handling animals, you induce stress and you potentially can cause problems. And then also you have to be aware of the animal's behavior. So, for example, with bears, at least, black bears, for example, you can put out a trap, and if there's a food reward in there, you'll capture a certain bear the first day, you tag it, release it, and then you set the trap again 3 days later, you might find the same bear there. So some bears might be very tolerant to being handled. Say, hey, if you're going to feed me, you can do anything you want to me. Raccoons are kind of like that too. So you'll keep catching the same raccoon over and over and over and over again because he doesn't care if you catch him or not. And then, so you have to be aware of that kind of prejudice that you would get in your capture and recapture. And bats are a little bit different, for example. In bats, we set up nets basically at dusk, usually over a stream. And so the first night, you'll be catching bats just about as fast as you can work. If you set up the net the second night in the same place, the second night, fewer bats. The third night, you won't see any bats at all. And if you're using night vision equipment, what you'll learn is the bats are still coming out. They're just going up and around the net. They know the net's there now, so they're looking for it. So they learn to avoid that. So it's very hard to recapture bats. So what you'd have to do then is wait a few weeks, come back, and do your recapture, because then they would have forgotten that they might get caught there. So the last thing I want to say about this then is that what has been transitioning is a lot of people are working with DNA fingerprint studies, basically capturing hair samples, doing DNA fingerprints, and using that to profile population. And the great thing about that is that you don't even have to handle the animal. You basically just set up roadkill, barbed wire around it, capture the hair, and you can profile the population. All right, so I'm out of time. I'll see you next time.